Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, it's Byron Stripling here from the Columbus Jazz Orchestra. And you know that the Columbus Jazz Orchestra is delicious, nutritious, good, and good for you. I know you're missing so many people out there. I know you're missing Michael Cox and Pete Mills and Byron Rooker. You're missing Linda Landis and Ryan Hamilton, and you're missing Jim Masters and Pat Lewis. I know that you're missing Jim Powell and Dwight Adams and Bob Breithaupt and Chris Berg. And I bet you're also missing Bobby Floyd. But you're going to get to see all of us soon. This is just a little temporary thing. And when we come out of it, we're going to be ready to swing our tails off. In the meantime, there are other ways, which I'll talk about later. But this is, to me, also a day of gratitude. Gratitude because it reminds me, when we came together and our community helped us to raise money for our 45th anniversary, and there was this sort of sense of belonging, and everyone was supporting the great work that was happening on stage. This has been a similar time because we've opened up our hearts to you, and you have responded in a great way. And what I'm talking about is the Jazz Emergency Fund. And this fund supports us. And as you guys know, the arts community has been devastated from the horrible coronavirus, but it's all throughout the world. And what we know is that the legacy of the Columbus Jazz Orchestra is important. And as I've always said, legacy is so important, but with legacy there comes a great responsibility. And that's a great word because it means that you have the ability to respond to any challenge. And you have definitely done that for us. And so you saw there just before a list of names of people that have helped us. I want to encourage you all to go to www.jazzemergencyfund.com. Once again, that's right on your screen, www.jazzemergencyfund.com. And there you can go make a contribution to the future and the legacy of the Columbus Jazz Orchestra, of the Jazz Arts Group. I want to remind you that it's not just the performances that you see on the stage, which are quite, we have a hall to pay for and stage hands and musicians and publicity and a full staff. It's all of those things. And we know that ticket sales don't actually cover but a certain small percentage of that. So we do appreciate your support, especially during this time. And we've had so many amazing people step up during this time. I'm almost done because we got an amazing guest for you. But I do want to acknowledge our friend Dennis, always acknowledging Ann and Tom, John and Patricia. We love you guys. Tom and Joan, who have forever been there for us. My friend Sandy and so many others. You saw the list that was scrolled by. So please join us at jazzemergencyfund.com and help us keep the music playing, because when we reemerge and come out here, we're going to be ready to swing, baby. We're going to set your soul on fire, as we've always said. The other thing you can do is that you could please consider returning your tickets from the last concert. And our concert in March has obviously been canceled too. Our April concert has been canceled. You can simply return those back to Kappa as a donation. And we would love it if you did that, because that would also help us for the future of the organization. They just turn them into a donation. So, but you have to call the Columbus Association for Performing Arts and ask them to release those tickets. And you simply go to 614-469-0939. Again, that's Columbus Association for Performing Arts. That's Kappa. They run the theaters here, and their number is 614-469-0939. So we thank you for all of those things. And that's just our little housekeeping. We also do want to remind you that Zach Compton, the great Zach Compton, you guys know he plays drums too. I don't think that a lot of people know that. He's one of the great drummers here in town. But he's going to be right here on Facebook. He does Thursdays, and he's at 6:30 also. And you can find all the episodes from past videos of all Zach's interviews. The one he did with the sax players was simply amazing. But this coming week, he has he's going to do the teachers from the Jazz Academy. And these guys are like Mark Donovan, Ryan Hamilton, Jess Sneeringer, and so many others. You're going to see all those guys. And Todd Stoll from Lincoln Center Jazz will also join us, because Todd used to be at Ohio. I am talking way too much. So let me just get to introducing my amazing friend here. He hails from, people don't know this, he hails from Cleveland, Ohio, and his prodigious talent got noticed very early. You saw him with the Tommy Dorsey Band under the direction of Buddy Morrow, And then he started doing these small clubs and then emerging into places like the Hollywood Bowl. And he's even headlined at places like Las Vegas, the Newport Jazz Festival, jazz festivals in Japan, jazz festivals in Europe. But here's a list, just a short list I picked up of Mel Torme. He often tells me stories about playing with Mel Torme, Hank Jones, Peggy Lee, George Shearing, Steve Allen. And here's one that'll sort of throw a wrench in the program. Madonna. He's played with Madonna, but he got his Concord Records contract. And then I was looking around trying to figure out how many albums he was on. I counted 70, but then I know of so many others. So it's well over 100 albums. And maybe I get a chance to ask that question. He is a special person to me and a person I've gotten to hang out with on the road. But before that, I want you to see his sense of humor. I want to play a little video for you. We'll do about 3 minutes of it. And this is just Ken being Ken, messing with me after my performance. And I didn't know this was going to happen. So go ahead and start that.
Be good, stay good, be good, be good, be cool. Oh, don't ever let them see you sweat. You got to be cool. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. I'm trying to work here.
Sorry, my car broke down outside. Does anyone have a new battery I can borrow?
A nude battery?
That was Byron.
Would you like my?
I just want to say I was out there for the first half, and I heard you. It was absolutely amazing performance, maybe the greatest performance I've ever heard from a man with so little talent. Anyway, this is like one of those Tonight shows where Bob Hope walks out and throws the whole thing into disarray. All right, Mr. Wise Guy. I'll bet you've got all these fancy charts that you put. I'll bet I could turn to this band and they could fake any one of the songs from my repertoire. For example, do you guys, by any chance, can we fake Bugle Call Rags? Oh, see? Nothing. All right, let's do that.
They don't have the music?
No.
Are you sure?
Oh, yeah.
If I were to look, it's
Oh, no.
I don't even need to look.
No, you don't need to look because they don't have the music. They're just faking it.
Okay, I want to see this.
All right, good.
great Ken Peplowski, ladies and gentlemen. Would you welcome him to Offstage Live? Ken Peplowski, are you there, Ken?
Yes, I am, Byron. Good talking to you, and I wish we could do this in person, but we'll get there, you know?
We'll get there very soon, I hope. First of all, I want to thank you for being here, and I want you to know, I hope that people will be able to get a sense of who you are as a person, because your on-stage persona is one thing. I know off stage, it's even more intriguing to me. When I often see you, you have music in one hand. Back then it was a tape recorder or a CD player, or now an MP3 player in the other hand, and a Kindle in your pocket somewhere. And I would come up to you and ask if I could sit with you at breakfast, and you always said yes. But all those three things were going. You were an intellectual who was constantly upgrading his brain with music and reading, and you would also have a New York Times tucked somewhere in between there. So you're always up on all of the things. I wanted people to get a sense of that. But before we do, let me just go from one of your first gigs. How did you get the Tommy Dorsey gig with Buddy Morrow?
I was, I guess, 19 years old, went to college for 2 years, and I had a quartet that got hired to play a short-lived Cleveland Jazz Festival. And it was my quartet, the Teddy Wilson Trio, and the Tommy Dorsey Band with Buddy Morrow. And Buddy heard me play, and they said, they were very encouraging. And he said, if you want to come on the road, you got a gig. They called. Actually, this is interesting. We could save this for my shrink. But the first time they called, my mother answered the phone and never told me they called. But thank God they were very persistent. There's a guy who I'm still very close friends with, the singer and road manager of the band, Leif Peterson, called again a month later, and I said, yes, I'll be there. And I left, and I was on that band for about 2 years, 2.5 years. All one-nighters, 48 weeks out of the year. Wow. It was still, I guess I was lucky. I caught the tail end of those traveling big bands, which for many musicians was an alternative, and a great alternative to going to music school, because you learned by jumping in there and doing it and picking people's brains, and a lot of listening, and Buddy was very helpful to me too.
Right. Cool story. And why did your mother not tell you about the call?
Well, it's one of those things where I had a band with my brother. We had a Polish polka band in Cleveland, Ohio, which is, I don't know if you realize that's the law. If you live in Cleveland and your name ends with the ski, you must play in a polka band. Or you're fined every year. But we played, so I did my first gigs when I was about 11 or 12, and we played, Polish polkas, and then we started branching out and doing other things. They were fine with me playing music as long as I kind of stayed in the family circle. But honestly, very discouraging about me branching out and doing other things too. But,
really?
I just had to forge my own path.
Yeah. So you're on Buddy Morrow's band. Is that where you first maybe got to meet Sonny Stitt?
Exactly. It is. Yes. It was in Chicago. We were both staying at one of those hotels that all the big bands used, and I cannot remember the name of it. You've probably stayed there too. And
the gig was probably at the Blackstone, but you weren't. Was it the Americana Congress?
I don't remember where we were working, but Sonny Stitt was at the Jazz Showcase, and It was Monday night, and we were both off. And back in those days, you could just call the front desk and say, "What room is Mr. Stitt in?" And they'd go ahead and tell you. So, there I knock on his door at noon. He opens the door in his pajamas. And we spent the entire day together, way until about midnight, like 12 hours with him, walking around.
So, can we clarify for our audience who may not know that Sonny Stitt was one of the greatest saxophone players in the world?
Absolutely.
You simply called his room and said, "Mr. Stitt, can I come up?" I mean, how did that transpire?
Yeah, I said, "Can I take a lesson with you?" And I brought my saxophone. I was playing alto on the Tommy Dorsey Band. And I have this giant fake book that we all had back then, 1,001 songs. It was 2 to a page. And I remember him going through the table of contents and just playing bits and pieces of like every song you could think of. He had an amazing repertoire of songs. and almost randomly picking keys to play them in too. And, I took 2 or 3 lessons from him. That one was the most important and was the longest. And the funny thing is I find myself doing what he was doing now. I travel a lot as a soloist, and I play with local trios, big bands, what have you. And, I always tell students, you could take his saxophone playing and pull it out of a recording, and everything you want musically is there. That great sense of time, melody, complete understanding of the chord changes, and a real sense of forward motion in the way he plays things, and beautiful sound. So, and he would talk about, playing with what you do if you're playing with a bad rhythm section, talked about critics, because he got branded for many years as being just a Charlie Parker disciple. Right. And he said, you know what? He said, at the end of the day, you have to play to please yourself, and that's the most important thing that counts.
Yeah, yeah. Any specific tips for improvisation that he gave you that you can remember? Like, was there one thing that a light bulb went off for you?
Well, I'll tell you, he talked a lot about breathing, and he would say, breathe from your toes to the top of your head. But it's funny, he didn't say very specific things, but he would play things for me. Like he would play something and I go, okay, that's a diminished scale he's playing now. Okay, now he's doing this. But he really talked about projecting the air and pushing the air through. And but I gotta say, like most of the things that I learned from him were so inspirational in a philosophical sense, because I got a real sense of what it was like for a man spending most of his time on the road by himself, and making the best of it and trying to have a consistent level of playing.
Yeah, yeah. But no specific, like, jazz education, came, maybe late 70s or when that was. He wasn't, in an old school way, was he basically like, just play the tune till you get it in your head, think about the changes? I mean, how was he?
Yeah, I mean, when you look, I took some lessons from Phil Woods too when I was younger, and most of the people from the bebop era, actually before that too, came, not to get too technical, but it's what we call a 2-5-1 based thing. There's a certain chord progression that you hear not only in jazz music but most of Western music, and so when as I said, he couldn't specifically explain, here's what I'm doing, but I would listen to it and go, oh, those are just a series of 2-5-1s that he's, adding one on top of another, substituting, chords. Yeah. So I could figure out what he was doing that way.
Right. So all of this begs the question is that you're this little Polish guy from Cleveland, and you're beginning to play jazz. You're going out on the Dorsey band, and you've got, in this house is, traditional family, the mom and a dad, I assume. Yeah. But you're also starting to love this jazz music, and you're getting idols like Sonny Stitt and Harry Sweets Edison and Duke Ellington and all these things. Was there any, which I know some families have, any pushback in having like all these sort of idols almost? I know how much you adore Duke and Sonny and all these guys. Any pushback from your family of having these people that you absolutely adore and they're black musicians, and you're little Polish Cleveland guy?
Wait a minute. Are you saying Duke Ellington was black? That changes everything. No, my father was a policeman, and I grew up in Garfield Heights, Ohio, which then was a largely all-white community. And I'm not trying to forgive his actions, but he was a largely a product of his time, in that we would sit around. He was very conservative, but very liberal in what we listened to. Mm-hmm. We would listen to everything from the Beatles to Duke Ellington to, Herb Alpert records, or Benny Goodman, of course, and Sonny Stitt. And he loved that music. And my mother did too. But it was that old school thing, he would let himself be entertained by them. But he would get a little uncomfortable because I'd bring these African-American musicians into the house and start jamming with them and playing with them. Mm-hmm. And he would definitely be uncomfortable with that, and we'd have these really heated arguments. And I'd say, well, how can you think both things? You can't kind of worship somebody as this great artist and then not treat them like a fellow human being with all that goes with it, you know. But he was that kind of person. He even had an African American partner for a while, and I would say, you know, well, what about that, you know? And he'd say, well, he's one of the good ones, you know, all those kind of things. And we used to watch All in the Family, if people remember that show. And I always had the feeling I was laughing at Archie Bunker, and he was laughing with him. But you know, it's interesting. Growing up in that environment, I was always a rebel, always stood up to what I considered injustices. I always, you know, stood up to bullies in school and kind of sided with the underdogs. And so he turned me into a person who never thinks about that stuff at all, honestly. Never have. I never will. When I was working with Benny Goodman, somebody was talking to him for an interview, and they said, you know, Benny, you're a racial pioneer. You know, you were one of the early people who integrated bands, and he said, no, not. He said, you know, all I did was, he said, I just hired the best people for the job.
Right. Yeah.
You know, I think that's a good answer.
Yeah, and I think so. You got to open up for Teddy Wilson, so we should mention who was in the first quartet.
Well, with Teddy Wilson at this time had a trio with his son.
Wow. Okay.
Theodore Jr. And I don't remember if he had two sons that played, but it was bass and drums. This is, you know, so he was long, you know, away from Benny and just, you know, playing these trio gigs everywhere. I did sit in with him actually on a tune or two.
Who, Teddy?
Yeah, and I was scared to death, you know.
I bet.
Yeah.
So we should let everybody know that the Benny Goodman Quartet was one of the first integrated ones. You can name them, or I will.
Well, it's Gene Krupa, Lionel Hampton, Benny, and Teddy Wilson.
Right.
And oh, sorry.
No, I think that was a tough one for a lot of people to see that, because back then it was basically, and Buddy DeFranco talks about this because he had Art Blakey on some of his gigs.
That's right.
And Buddy said, you know, we would go into a club and they say, okay, you're cool to play tonight, but we don't want the black guy on the drums, which was Art Blakey. And Buddy said he said, well, then there's not going to be any gig tonight. And I'm sure Benny was up against very similar circumstances.
Sure he was. Artie Shaw too. You know, Artie.
Yes, with Billie Holiday and
Roy Eldridge too. You know,
yes. And then also, didn't Benny have Cootie Williams for a second?
He sure did.
Yeah.
Great band from around 1940. In fact, there was another band that wrote a song called "When Cootie Left the Duke." It was such a big deal.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, since we're into big bands, I have a record. It's a 2-album set. I picked it up at the Public Library in St. Paul, Minnesota, and you could check out 10 records at a time. This one caught my eye. It was a Duke Ellington record called The Great Paris Concerts. Wow. It changed my life. What did that record do for you?
Byron, I think we may have had this conversation. It changed my life. That's one of my all-time Desert Island discs, The Great Paris Concert. To this day, I tell people, you know, if you are on the fence about jazz music, or you don't think it's too hard to listen to, or you don't understand it, if you're going to get one record, that's the one to get. Mm-hmm. Because it's Duke's band. I think it's his second great band, you know, maybe third great band. There was the early band with Barney Bigard, then the Ben Webster years. Mm-hmm. And then this band, recorded in the early 1960s with Jimmy Hamilton, Cat Anderson, Cootie was in the band, Ray Nance, Paul Gonsalves, Johnny Hodges, Lawrence Brown, Sam Woodyard, one of my favorite drummers. And it's got everything there. It's got some of his extended suites. It's got some of the hits. Shows off all the great soloists in the band. And that really turned me around. In fact, the person who really made me want to play jazz clarinet much more than Benny was Jimmy Hamilton.
Wow.
Because if you listen to him, and then if you watch him play now on YouTube, he looks like the world's greatest classical clarinetist. He could have played in an orchestra. He had that beautiful, dark, round sound and perfect, you know, fingers hardly moving. And I always thought to myself, that's for me. You know, if I could, I'm still striving to achieve that. But, I always think, why do you have to sacrifice your sound on clarinet just because you're playing jazz? Mm-hmm. You know, so many people try to play jazz clarinet. I'm going to just show you a little demonstration here. Just happen to have this.
I can't believe you don't have the reed all ready to go.
Well, so many people try to play jazz and it winds up sounding like this. You know, that kind of,
Yeah.
You don't have to do that. I try to not change my sound from playing jazz to classical. Maybe I use a little more vibrato on jazz, but that's about it. But that so impressed me with him.
Yes.
He was a real hero of mine.
Well, since we're talking about Duke Ellington and you have your horn there, I have a request, or you could play whatever you want, but could you play a little bit of the Single Petal of a Rose?
Yeah.
Duke
Now,
Ellington?
did we talk about the payment for this thing, or?
First send us a contribution at jazzemergencyfund.com.
All right. Okay, here we go.
See if we can.
I'll play a little bit of this. I love this piece so much.
Is this Strayhorn or is it Duke?
I think it's Duke because it was written for the Queen Suite, which is a suite of songs recorded with everything from solo piano to big band. He cut a record for the Queen of England. She had a copy, he had a copy, and the rest of us got to hear the music after Duke passed on. Mm-hmm. And there's a beautiful piano solo, and I think it's his composition because it sounds like him improvising at the piano, which he did a lot of times too in front of songs.
Yeah.
And it's called The Single Petal of a Rose, and this is my interpretation of that. That's just a little taste of that.
That's so pretty. I love the way you play that. And I've heard you play it like in a hall with no mic, basically, just a little bit of mic. And
if I get a really nice, quiet audience, very respectful audience, a lot of times that's the encore because it's nice to just leave them with that little bouquet, as it were,
Absolutely. Well, we mentioned Benny, and most of your interviews, there's a lot of time spent on that, and I don't want to do that in this interview. I do remember we talking about Benny, and you said he surprised you. He was doing good things for you without you even knowing, and I think you found out from somebody else. Did you have that?
Yeah.
story?
Well, I very naively gave him a demo tape that I'd been shopping around in trying to get a record deal. And by this time, I'd kind of become almost the de facto straw boss of the band. And so we were having lunch at the Carnegie Deli just about every week. And
okay, how were those conversations? Because I didn't meet Benny, but I heard he had a very strange demeanor, kind of quiet. Did he pick up the check for you?
I think I always picked up the check, but it's not because he didn't offer. I just wanted to do it. I was so thrilled. You asked about this, and I wish I could go back in time and be the person I am now, with him, because I was so nervous around him.
Yeah.
I was afraid of getting fired. I just wanted to be there for him. I was so respectful of him. He was such a hero, but he was genuinely into this band. He had a band of much younger people that really loved playing his music. There were a bunch of people around New York, as you were, around that time, and we all liked playing standards and playing that kind of music. And he found us, we found him, and he loved it. And so I'd given him this demo tape, and he shows up at the Carnegie Deli afterwards, and he goes, I listened to the tape. It sounds nice. And I thought that was a dismissal.
Yeah.
And after Benny died, the president of the record label that he recorded his last album for came up to me at a gig and said, I just want you to know Benny not only wanted us to sign you, he offered to produce the record too.
My God.
Which just reduced me to, a puddle hearing that,
Yeah.
And he sent me flowers at my wedding, and he was so there were a lot of different sides to Benny, not just this, evil person who fired people, at whim. I think by and large, he was so obsessed with music, that's 99% of what he focused on during the day. And sometimes that got in the way of personal relations.
Right. So that absent-mindedness that I've always heard about, that was, you just think he just was probably thinking about tunes and stuff.
Because, for example, we'd rehearse at the Wellington Hotel, and he would, this is like almost 50 years later, and he was still trying to find nuances in these Fletcher Henderson arrangements, finding new tempos, making smart edits, What
did he call Fletcher?
Well, he called him his Mozart.
Yes.
Yeah, he would say that to the audience. He dedicated concerts. I think he dedicated this TV special we did to Fletcher Henderson. He really loved him and always went back to those arrangements over everything else.
Yeah. And in rehearsals, though it was weird, Kenny Washington talks about how Benny was always messing with him, because Kenny was one of the first drummers in that group, or was it a different group?
No, Kenny was in that group for a little bit. I think sometimes, again, Benny was such a giant, that he didn't like when rhythm sections tried to play like the records too. And I'm not saying that's what Kenny did, but I know drummers that came in and tried to sound like Gene Krupa, and he didn't want that. We had Mel Lewis for the first rehearsal, and Mel just played like himself and swung those Fletcher Henderson things, to the ends of the earth. And I think Benny's whole point of this music, it wasn't nostalgia for him. It was just great music that he was constantly trying to make fresh again.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I could talk Benny with you forever, but as your career started to move forward, you were starting to play with everybody, and in every club. What's the club in New York? You had to go up those stairs. Jay's. You were at Jay's all the time.
All the time. 97th and Broadway. I was there all the time. We had such a great crowd there that people were sometimes lined up down the stairs and out the street around the block.
Are you serious? And who was your band back then?
A lot of times it was Benny Aronoff on piano. Sometimes it was Frank Vignola on guitar, Joel Forbes on bass, Tom Bolito on drums. That was pretty much Murray Wall, a guy named Murray Wall.
Yeah.
We played there together, you and I.
Is Murray still playing?
Yeah, Murray's still playing, yeah. And I got a call from Jack Sheldon once, the great trumpet player, telling me he was going to be in Atlantic City for a month with Merv Griffin, and could I get him Monday nights? And I said, this is a club. It pays like $100, and they're not going to put you up at a hotel. He says, no, I just want to play. This guy, I booked him with my band 4 Mondays in a row, drove up from Atlantic City, played the gig, drove back to Atlantic City just to play.
Wow. Well, that's a jazz musician for you.
Yeah.
And there's you talk about Jack Sheldon. You told me that when you went on tour with him, he was practicing in the hotel the whole time.
Yeah. Everybody thinks, I wrote about this in the Jazz Times. They asked me to write a little thing about him. Everybody thinks of Jack as this comic and, funny guy, which he was. But he took music very, very seriously and never, ever stopped practicing. You'd walk past his hotel room. You'd hear him practicing with a mute. He'd get on the bus and play in the back of the bus. He's just playing all the time.
Wow. See, I never knew that. You told me that he practiced in the hotel and stuff, but who knew?
Yeah.
Who knew? Yeah. And so you're moving along, and then pretty soon you start leading your own big bands, and then you got, because I think of and you tell me the Concord Records contract, you got really popular in Japan too. And,
yes. Yeah. At that time. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, at that time, Concord had these Concord Fujitsu festivals and big package tours, just very much like the old Jazz at the Philharmonic things. Mm-hmm. And so it might be one year I took a big band with Sweets, Edison, and then we'd have Ray Brown's trio on the bill and maybe a vocalist like Carol Sloan. They were really great times, and the Japanese are the best audiences of all, and they took really great care of us, and everything. You know, they carried your suitcases everywhere. You travel with a sound crew that was so good that after the first couple gigs, I didn't even bother with sound checks anymore because the sound was consistently great every single night.
Yeah, incredible. And you mentioned Sweets Edison. I know you did a tour where Sweets was in your band.
Yeah.
And you have always had a love for Sweets. If people go on YouTube, they can see some recordings with you and Sweets. And tell me about your relationship.
Well, I miss him. I think he was appropriately named because he was a sweetheart. And here's Sweets Edison. That first time I took a big band there, in those days, it was a lot more cost effective to bring bands out from LA to Japan than New York. So the promoters asked me to bring a mostly LA based band. Mm-hmm. So I had Sweets. I think I had Lou Levy, Larry Gales, maybe Frank Capp, maybe Butch Miles. I can't remember on that tour, but all LA guys, and a lot of them I didn't know at that time.
Yes.
So, and they didn't know me because I was pretty young. You know, Carl Jefferson, the head of Concord Records, was sending me out there. This is what he would do for us. You know, he'd send me out on the tour trying to promote us, help sell the records, and we'd meet more people and, you know, just push you on almost in the spotlight. So I was a little nervous. And as you know, you've led so many bands and orchestras over the years. If you show that sometimes to musicians that you don't know, they can feed on that too. And it gets, you know, can get kind of uncomfortable. And a lot of these musicians were giving me a really hard time, you know, like, you know, coming up to me and saying, well, you know, look, it's time for a break now. We've been rehearsing for 45 minutes. You know, we got to, you know, and so-and-so feels he's not getting enough solo space. And, you know, why do we have to do this? And why, you know, can't we go back to the hotel and get dressed first? And I'm just like despondent, you know. And it's about 4 gigs in to this month-long tour. And we're on the bullet train and going from one town to another. And we're all in the same car. Sweets comes up to me, stands over me, and speaks loudly so everyone in the train can hear. And I'm going to clean this up for the internet. But he says, listen, man. He goes, I'm here because of you, not because of these no-playing jive. You know, he goes, I'm taking orders from you. He says, don't take any crap from them. You know, you could play circles around them. And just remember that. And, you know, anybody else that has anything to say, they got to go through me first. He turned everything around.
Yeah.
By doing that for me, which he certainly didn't have to do. And I'll never forget that ever. Because, boy, what an act of kindness that was, you know?
Yes. Wow, that's a great story. I've heard you tell that before. And the first time you told me, I don't want to embarrass you, you started crying.
Yeah, of course.
You love him so much.
I do. And, you know, we were lucky, you and I. We met, in a sense, the last wave of those great players from, for lack of a better description, the swing era. You know, I got to play a lot with Milt Hinton, who was another guy. Tell
me some Milt Hinton stories.
Milt Hinton, I get a phone call. I've been in New York for maybe 6-8 months. I get a phone call. Is this Ken Peplowski? Yes. This is the judge, Milt Hinton. He goes, I've been hearing about you. He goes, it's time we should meet. Wow. He says, bring your horns. And he had a little apartment he kept in Manhattan in addition to the place in Queens. I meet him at this place. We just played together for like 2 hours, and that was his way of welcoming me into the fold.
Wow.
You know, and he did that with everybody. You know, he bought Bob Cranshaw a bass case because he thought his bass case was too ratty looking, and people wouldn't think as much of him unless he had a professional looking case. He
bought a bass player a coat one time. The guy was like new to New York. He just gave the next time he saw the guy, he had a coat he gave him. You know?
See, you know, and like I said, he did that with everybody and always made you feel good and always came to play 100%.
Yeah.
You know, it didn't matter what the gig was. I played Bad Weddings with him. I played Carnegie Hall. It didn't matter. He treated every gig the same, you know, playing full out. And that I learned a lot from him, and also from guys like Buddy Tate and Al Gray and Gus Johnson, Hank Jones.
And these guys
Hyman.
they were nice to Dick.
Yeah.
And
But
that's
they
one
were
of the
so
records
nice and welcoming, and as you know too, because you met all these people, and they give you a little bit of grief, like this hazing ritual almost, but it was that old school thing which we still talk about. If they like you, they insult you, and give you a little bit of a hard time, and then that means you're in,
Yeah.
Flip
Well, the
Philip.
most nervous Flip. Yeah, you always talk about him. The most nervous I was meeting another clarinet player and having to do a jam session with him, and he wouldn't speak to me until after the first tune. Kenny DeVerne.
Well, yeah, he could be pretty tough. Yeah.
And I was so nervous. And so he called all of me. I was like, okay, I'm safe. I can get through all of me. And after I finished my solo, he's like, sounds good. What do you want to play? Otherwise, he was like testing me to see if I could.
Yes, he was.
Get through the tune. And before the gig there, he had an argument with a sound man, which he did at every concert.
Yes, he did. It was kind of funny. First of all, Kenny DeVerne.
Should we tell everybody Kenny DeVerne was one of the great clarinet players?
Absolutely. In fact, I always think he got a kind of short shrift over the years because he was branded a traditional jazz player, which people, then they start saying Dixieland, or it sounds like this music with the straw hat and the striped vest,
Mm-hmm.
But he was a phenomenal technician on the clarinet. Next to Artie Shaw, Kenny DeVerne had the best control of an entire upper octave of the horn that no one else could play.
Wow.
Just complete ease. And he also had one of the biggest sounds I've ever heard on the clarinet.
Yeah.
So that meant he could fill up most rooms without a microphone. The problem is the rest of us couldn't do that.
Yeah.
So he'd get on, instead of talking to the sound guys before, this was a little bit of drama on his part. He'd come up on stage and take these things away, big sweeping motion, and make a big deal out of taking them. And the rest of us are going, wait a minute, I kind of need this,
Yeah.
But you could hear him in the back of the room clearer.
Oh, yeah. One of the greats, Kenny DeVerne. As you progressed, Sarah Simon, our friend Sarah, has a question, and she wanted to know that as you got more successful, and obviously you didn't stop learning, but did your way of practicing change? Did you start practicing in different ways to keep yourself up, or
I did, because I travel almost half the year on the road. Combine that with, since 1981, living in apartments means, first of all, you have to learn to practice very softly. And that's actually a good discipline, because I think for any wind player, because you learn how to project the air through, and it's a lot easier to blat out, for example, a high note with a lot of force and volume than it is to play that same high note softly and with the same, round, beautiful sound that you're going for in the rest of the instrument. So I practice softly. And also, because if I'm traveling a lot, I don't have time to practice. I have a very concentrated way of practicing, which I'll explain very quickly. But if I have 30 minutes, here's how I divide up the pie chart. And people could expand this to however much time they have. But I would take 15 minutes of that and sight read classical etudes. Mm-hmm. And the sight reading is important too, because it keeps your brain alert. It makes you able to scan a page very quickly and look for any musical landmines, as it were, are there funny rhythms, key changes. And then you try to play it all the way through without making a mistake, with a metronome or you acting as your own metronome. Then you can go back and fix whatever you feel needs to be fixed. Then I take, this is on the clarinet, then I take 5 minutes and work on something new for myself, a new song, Mm-hmm. Then I'd work on an old tune that I haven't maybe looked at in a while. Then I'd pick up the saxophone just to remind myself of what I want the sound to be like, because I do treat them like two separate instruments. saying that, the technique tends to transfer right over from the clarinet, but the embouchure and the sound I think of in two different ways. And that's, for me, is a very efficient way to practice in however much time you have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's helpful to all of us.
Can I ask, what is your practice thing?
I think that practice is a sign of insecurity, and I'm very secure with my abilities. So
it's interesting you say that, because I've always thought that guys that say that practice is a sign of insecurity, that in itself is a sign of insecurity. But go ahead. All right, we're done. We're done.
I'm in my practice room. It's downstairs here, and it's the place that I need to live to just make anything happen. And stagnation does not look good on me. And my practice technique has changed over the years. I've actually changed my playing over the last 5 years. I mean, I used to play really loud and worry about my chops, but now I'm a slow learner, but I learned from people like Sweets and all that. Let's just go back to him, because that was what became one of my models about, when I started doing gigs with him. After Dizzy died, they had those groups they put together. It would be like Sweets and Claudio Roditi and
Clark.
And Clark, they would do these massive tours, and they would have music, but none of those guys wanted to read, not that they couldn't. So they would hire me and I just get to sit. I mean, one of them was Claudio, Freddie Hubbard, and me. It's like I got to sit between those two guys. It was like at the Hollywood Bowl or something. It was, a big Dizzy tribute. And I noticed with all those guys, none of them played like lead trumpet players, which is what I was trained to do. Sweets, when I would sit next to him, one time we did Sweets, John Faddis and myself, and Faddis played the most incredible solo right before Sweets. And then Sweets sort of looked at him and said, "You didn't leave me nothing to play," And then he picked up his horn, and he was so old he could hardly find where to put the mouthpiece. He was, how he used to, like where, because I watched him like and he played like 3 or 4 notes. And everything everybody had played before that meant nothing.
Yes.
It just right. Really, and the audience, you could hear them, they went, it's like they just relaxed from the music. It took a different swing, and it wasn't. So, my time is just figuring out how to keep progressing forward.
I also find, and James Moody used to talk about this too, a lot of, you can do a lot of great practicing in your head, away from the instrument. A lot of good practicing. You can listen as a form of practice and put yourself in everyone's shoes, not just your same instrument. And also visualize lines, and also, like you're talking about, think about the sound too. Just think about it and what you want to sound like. Just one more thing about Sweets, because isn't it amazing how he could play any year of his professional career? You could listen to him, and it always sounded contemporary. In 1983, he didn't sound like a guy who was playing with Basie in 1938.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
It was amazing. He just was timeless.
And he didn't care. There were some tunes he would play that have hard changes, and he figured out a way to negotiate any set of changes, man.
Yeah.
It's just, Warren Vacher said, "Sweets, here's around the corner." That was his thing. He could just do that. Yeah. As I mentioned when we first started, whenever I'm around you, you seem obsessed with knowledge, and you always have books with you and all these things. And that sort of begs the question. You were talking about Sonny and how, well, he was alone a lot and all that. And your love of books, it just made me think, is that because you're often alone, and that's your dance partner for the night. That's the thing that you can go to sleep with. There's a feeling there. Did you start reading more when you got on the road, or did you always love books? And
to be honest, I was always a voracious reader. Back in, I actually remember reading books that I didn't really understand. I was reading Kafka when I was in 6th grade. I read The Plague when I was in 6th grade, just because I set myself these challenges. And my mother was a big reader, and again, there's some rough stuff in the family, and it took me into another world. In fact, my goals when I was a kid were to either I wanted to play music, be a writer, or be an animator, because I loved animated cartoons, the old classic Disney cartoons and things like that, Warner Brothers. But so I always loved reading, but it's such a great thing to do on the road. Positive thing, And I like to read. I actually set a kind of a nerdy goal for myself. I alternate fiction and nonfiction in my reading. So
would there be? I mean, there's one book I have heard you talk about. It's by this guy who used to write for Groucho, I think, or
S.J. Perelman.
What's
my all-time favorite?
Tell me about your love of him.
Yeah, no one knows about him anymore, and it's so sad. He at one time was the biggest humorist out there, writing regular humor pieces for the New Yorker, and he wrote 2 of the Marx Brothers movies. And he was this brilliant wordsmith who wrote these short humor pieces that were always about him, generally about him, or satires on famous movies and things like that. And he used a lot of Yiddish words. And I was a Catholic boy growing up in Garfield Heights, but I bought The Joys of Yiddish and all those books to learn these words, because sometimes the name of a person in the stories is funny when you know what it means.
Yeah.
And he portrayed himself as this lecherous old man, when he was traveling around on these world tours. And I read his stuff even now, and a lot of it's out of print, but you can find it all. It's so beautiful, actually, because he labored over every word choice is perfect for the sentence, and he could spend months and months and months just writing, a 3 or 4 page piece. Right. And always kind of bristled at the fact that people never took him seriously because he wrote short pieces, But that's like an argument when CDs first came out. People would review it and say, well, they didn't fill up all the time on the CD. The playing time's too short. That's like telling somebody, I bought your book, but it was only 200 pages. It should have been 500 pages,
Right.
So, but yeah, I love his writing, and I come back to it a lot. And I love to read, I call them the 3 Charles brothers. Charles Dickens, Charles Bukowski, who wrote he wrote great poetry and great novels that are very thinly disguised autobiographical works. He wrote one called Post Office, which is about his travails trying to work what he considered menial jobs, because he couldn't sell his pieces.
Yes.
And then Charles Portis, he's a guy who just passed away this year, who wrote maybe 5 or 6 books, and they're all gems. And I love his books because he wrote True Grit, which people would know him from.
Yeah.
He wrote one called The Dog of the South and one called Norwood. There's almost no plot whatsoever, but the most interesting, funny, touching characters you've ever read in your life. I mean, just really fantastic characters in there.
Yeah.
So
that's all good stuff. Is there any particular way that you feel that reading has changed or enriched your life? Any specific things that you can point to? Actually,
I was telling my girlfriend this the other day. I'm reading Charles Dickens' Little Dorrit, because I love his books so much I savor them and read one every few years. We're going through tough times now, right? All of us.
Yeah.
I read something like that, honestly, Byron, it gives me faith in mankind that somebody could write something like this. It's 800 some pages that he wrote actually in serial form. He wrote on the fly as he was going. He'd write the chapter and send these out to magazines. And it's great plots. It's funny. There's characters that you might change the costumes, but you meet the same types of people today. The books are about every foible of human nature, and they make you cry, they make you laugh. And I get so inspired by anything like that, honestly, it gives me hope. And my goal when I play music, if I could project or get that feeling, the same feeling out of people by anything I play that I get from reading him or listening to Duke or listening to the Beatles. I'm a big fan. Then I've really accomplished something. That's my goal. I want to move people the way they did, And
let's go there. I know your love of the Beatles. I know about your love of Elvis.
Yes,
you've been to Graceland.
I sure have. I'm proud of it.
And you've also, I think you're also an Elton John fan.
I like a lot of pop music, and Joe Cocker.
But you're not supposed to say that as a jazz.
That's right. We've talked about this too. Stevie Wonder, songs in the key of life, But again, I think actually, a lot of our musician friends will secretly admit that they listen to everything,
Yeah.
My friend.
So tell me about Abbey Road, the Beatles.
Yeah. Okay.
You love that.
That band. Actually, I grew up. I was born in 1959. I grew up. So I was 5 years old when A Hard Day's Night came out in 1964. And again, they got me through a rough childhood because of that sense of hope. The joy of every next record they did was not only better than the one before and more interesting, but literally changed music. Mm-hmm. If you go through the string of albums they did, the way they played, the way they wrote, there's this unbelievable progression in what was only 7 or 8 years of recording. Yeah. And Abbey Road was their last record. And it's so great. There's a long medley on side 2 of the album, and it's still moving to me. I remember being a kid and hearing that for the first time. I still get chills. Like I would listen to Here Comes the Sun over and over and over again and just feel good. Like this is giving me some hope. It is. This is the power of great music,
Yes. Oh. A quick favorite songs of Elvis. Give me 2 or 3.
I love his ballads. I think he became a killer ballad singer. So I love those wrist slashing, torch songs. Always, he did a great version of "Always on My Mind." "Separate Ways" was another one. All through the 70s, he did these heavy torch songs. He did one called "It's Over," which is great, which he performed live quite often, and he did a great version of "The Impossible Dream" too, which is a real favorite of mine. But the same thing applies, Byron. If I could convey the same sense of emotion that he did, and I don't have the luxury of using words when I'm presenting a song, then I feel like my job is done. That's that's what I get from them, and that's what I'm trying to pass on.
Okay, a quick couple Elton John.
I've always liked, actually all of Goodbye Yellow Brick Road is great. And I know it's trite to say this because, it became something else, but the original Candle in the Wind is just a beautiful song,
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I have seen you perform all over the place, overseas and all these different places, and people come back and adore you and love you. And what I want to say to you and say to our audience is that those emotions that you express that you get from Sonny Stitt and Duke Ellington and Elvis and the Beatles and all that, you do that too. And I think that the world is a better place because you're in it, because we need your music more than ever now. I want to encourage our audience to go and download your recordings. I don't want them to go to the store because it'll be closed.
Yeah, that's right.
but go to your stuff is available on iTunes.
Yes, it is. Yeah, a lot of it is. Yeah,
a lot of that is, and you could always order probably some still. If you buy CDs, you can probably get a CD from Amazon and places like that. But Ken, we just want you to know that in Columbus here, you have lifted up so many people by your amazing playing. And you're talking about the chills and all that. When I hear you play, I get that. You have a consistency in the way that you play. The standard is always up here. And that's why, like, to be on stage with you, that band that you saw in the very beginning, that's why they loved you, because you make the band play better. It's like, they asked about leadership, and leadership is when you show up, not because of any specific thing. Well, there are specific things, but just one guy shows up and everything gets better. And that's what happens when you get on stage. No matter what the group is, no matter what the band is, there's another level. I've seen you do it at Carnegie Hall with the Carnegie Hall Jazz Band, where there was nothing but craziness going on in rehearsal and jokes and, people making, whoopee cushion noises. And here you come and you start playing and it gets quiet. And so I just want to thank you for that through the years. And I want to have many more years and times on stage with you, because you are simply fantastic.
Well, thank you, Byron. And, I'm not just like throwing you back a automatic compliment, but one of the reasons I love you so much, I think we see things a lot alike. You and I, we like to entertain an audience, and you're so great at that. But we take the music seriously. And I've always said the two things don't have to be mutually exclusive. Duke, our hero, was a master of that. Mm-hmm. He would, say kind of funny, amusing things to the audience. Ray Nance would do dancing, and he'd bookend his difficult new suites with the hits, so that he'd kind of take the audience by the hand and bring them in. And I love to do that. It's nice to be a little bit of a missionary for this music, and you're so great at that. You are, and so I think that's one of the many reasons why we've stayed close friends all these years.
Well, it's a joy to talk to you, and always a joy to be in your presence. I always learn something, and especially when we're at breakfast somewhere and you're teaching me about the latest book that you've read. So thank you for being with us. And again, we remind our audience again, go to jazzemergencyfund.com and help us continue these great interviews and the things that we'll continue to do for you online. Look for Ken Peplowski online, download his stuff. We'll try to have, and I can communicate when we thank Zach and Alexa, I'll try to get those books that you mentioned, and we'll try to throw those up too on the Facebook page. Ken Peplowski, you're simply the best. We will look forward to seeing you next time, all right?
Thank you, Byron. You take care. And everybody out there, stay safe and healthy, please.
Yes, and social distance. Stay away from each other.
Right, exactly.
We love everybody. We'll see you next time. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.